Evening, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of I'm Not Sure What. It's a crossover. We're doing a thing, reaching across the country, arms open wide. We're sitting down tonight as a joint venture to prove that Ontario and Alberta don't have to be fighting always. We can be besties. We're doing a bit of a joint venture tonight with The Breakdown and the 905er podcast, which is, I'm told, operating out of a 416 area code. I could be wrong, but I'm gonna throw it over to the host of that to correct everything I just said.
Well, yeah, thank you, Nate, very much. And no, we're very much not in the 416 because that would just be a scandal unto itself that I don't think we could ever live down. No, we're very much Roland, Tanner, and myself are very much alive and well in the 905 area code, which is for those in Alberta who are wondering what the heck's a 905er. We are the area code surrounding Toronto that is in the midst of reshaping itself into a more dynamic part of the country to live in. And Roland and I are part of that, that definition of what exactly is the 905 region going to turn into.
You know what? It's actually, sorry, Alberta listeners, but it's actually the 905 that's pretty much made you, given you a liberal federal government for the last however long. It's down to us. I'm sorry. It's very much that suburban area around Toronto that just votes. How it votes one way or the other, either can PC at a provincial level or Liberal or a federal level in recent history has swung the election one way or the other. So that's kind of why we started.
So you're like the Calgary of Ontario then?
Yeah.
That could be a new motto.
In all kinds of ways. Yeah, I mean, it's and we're also, I don't know if this applies to Calgary, but it certainly applies to the 905. It's a region that doesn't get into news much. It's the term 905er is kind of a slur that people from Toronto say, all these darn 905ers coming into our city and clogging up the bars. It's a kind of wasteland of suburban boringness is what is the myth. And we kind of set up the podcast to try and counter that a bit. I'm not going to lie, that element does exist, but there's also some really vibrant cities. There's huge diversity in terms of the population, in terms of where it comes from, in terms of new immigrants, in terms of everything, and about 4 million people, which is, let's face it, bigger than quite a few provinces in terms of population, living in this place that basically gets ignored by Toronto media just as much as, say, Western Canada often gets ignored by Toronto media. So we kind of felt it was important to try and cover the area and the area's specific needs in its own right, rather than always in the kind of shadow of Toronto.
So it sounds like you're doing like the 905 is calling.
A little bit.
And just trying to, wake people up to, I mean, and I'm sure this has happened in Alberta too. Local media has basically died. Traditional local media, print media, has died, and there are the rotting carcasses of a few local newspapers still exist, but they're pretty bad. A city like we both used to live in Burlington, which is just about an hour outside Toronto. I now live in Hamilton, which is the next city along, but a city like Burlington, which is not particularly big, it's about, 450,000 people. I don't know, 180,000 people, something like that. Used to have 4 newspapers back in the day, coming out a couple of times a week. Now there's one, and it's a joke. With the greatest of respect to the people who work for it, it's not their fault, but it is a joke. So what's going on and where people live just doesn't get covered in the way that it used to at all anymore, and someone's got to do it.
Yeah, we've got an outlet that tries to do that, and they do a pretty good job, but they do more deep dive kind of stuff. They're called The Sprawl here in Calgary. I have their sticker on my water bottle because I'm cool like that. But
I think I've come across them. Yeah,
they're amazing. Jeremy Clauses with The Sprawl does amazing. But I know that they're struggling for the readership, and we've certainly seen the erosion of. I mean, I think most of what we read in the Calgary Herald or the Calgary Sun is written largely out of Toronto, except for a couple of the editorials, but it's gone from the Calgary Herald and the Calgary Sun being two entirely separate newspapers to now, if you buy a copy of the Calgary Herald, you're buying all of the same articles that appear in the Sun. You're just getting slightly less colorful advertising.
Well, that's the problem that we saw, that we found, was that everything was just it was literally the same. It'd be the same articles reprinted in various papers in the 905 supposedly local newspapers. And you're right, like it's all being pumped out of Toronto, especially, well, I mean, today this week we've heard about the Bell Media layoffs, and the idea is, okay, you're going to cover the entire country. I mean, our region, we try to cover our region of about 4 million people as best we can, the two of us, with the meager resources we have, and it's darn hard. It is a hard job to do, to try and get the stories that you think are important, that people should know about and talk about. I can't imagine saying, okay, I'm going to try all that, plus let's throw in, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, and all other provinces. You're going to be able to get those stories that are important to to those living in the small towns across the country. The math doesn't work out for me, and it's I mean, if they're not going to do it properly, the rest of us have to kind of pick up the slack and just try and make it happen as best we can, which is why I like listening to your podcast, because it does give me informed on a part of the country that, quite frankly, I would not like. I know more about Alberta politics than I do about than I would reading it in the Toronto Star or the Globe, I'm sure.
There's a lot that's going on in Alberta politics these days, though. So it's like,
well, maybe just give for our listeners who aren't familiar with you, give the elevator pitch of the Breakdown podcast, and why they should be listening, and how it came to be.
Wow, that's a whole lot there to unpack. Well, the elevator pitch of the Breakdown is kind of tied to its origin story, which is profoundly embarrassing for me. Because back in 2019, in the provincial election that occurred, I made the spectacular mistake of running for the position of MLA, or provincial MP, I think you guys call it out there. Yep. But I ran with a party called the Alberta Party and got my ass handed to me. But as part of my campaign, one of the things that I realized was the vast majority of the people that I was talking to when I was knocking on doors and when I was interacting with them on social media had no idea about what the issues were, whether we're talking locally or at the provincial level. They had no clue. And so during my campaign, one of the things that I did was I put out these little short videos, usually like 3 to 5 minutes at the most, where I would talk about, here's one of the issues that's facing the province right now. Here's one of the issues that's facing this constituency right now. And when it ended, I had a couple of people say, please don't stop that. And so a group of people got together, and we decided to put together the thing that has become the Breakdown. And the mandate is basically, we're trying to get people engaged in political conversations, using any means necessary. So we do a lot of satire, we do a lot of humor. On occasion, we use puppets. And at the same time, we also try to encourage the idea of having conversations, because far too often the political discourse, especially in Alberta, is you're wrong and I don't want to hear anything else. And that only, I mean, we're seeing more and more the polarization that's yielded here in this province. And so the idea of the show is maybe we can have some conversations about politics without it turning into a shouting match, and at the same time, maybe we can have a little bit of fun too. And so that's what we try to do.
It's a great.
That was a long elevator ride. I apologize.
No, it's a tall building to get to the top, for sure. But I've listened to a couple of your episodes, and you do a great job. I especially, there's one episode I listened to, your interview with Charles Adler a little while ago. And if you get a chance, folks, go search in Nate's back catalog for that one. It's a really fascinating talk about the state of Canadian media from the king of Canadian media, Charles Adler, and just it's a really informative kind of come to reality kind of episode on the state of the kind of what we've been talking about, just kind of giving some meat on the bones to it. I do recommend you go listen to it, folks, if you get a chance to.
Like and subscribe, as the kids say.
Yes, absolutely. Which is kind of why, I reached out to you back when the Alberta provincial election was still happening, and there seemed to be,
well, it still is.
Okay. Well, I mean, for those of us who don't live in Alberta, I understood it is it's over, it's done. It was pretty definitive. But when I reached out to you because at the time it looked like there was going to be a shift in power, that at the time Rachel Notley looked like she might win. Obviously, spoiler alert for those of you who don't know, she did not. Danielle Smith won a majority government, and she. Now, I'm hoping that you're not going to correct me. She is the premier of Alberta, correct?
Yes, for now.
Okay.
What's been happening?
A whole bunch of background that goes on there. So there's two things that have happened, which is why I made the joke about the election isn't actually over. There are two constituencies where the difference in votes was less than 100. And so that triggered an automatic recount through Elections Alberta. But when Elections Alberta does the recount, what they do is they look at all of the votes that were cast on election day. Now, the two people who got punted are two previously fairly high profile UCP MLAs, and one very, very high profile cabinet minister, Tyler Shandro. He lost by, I think it's like 25 votes now, 24 votes or something like that. And the next step in that process, should someone choose to pursue it, is somebody can file for a judicial recount. And the word came out today that both of those constituencies, the UCP has come forward and said, we want judicial recounts going on. So now all of the votes that were cast in all of the places and all of the things are going to get recounted, and it's going to be supervised by a judge. So it's not going to make a difference in who's forming government. Danielle Smith will be the premier for, at the very least, a little while. But there's all kinds, it's Alberta. So there's all kinds of fascinating machinations that are going on in the background. And there's a lot of people sort of going, how long is she going to be able to hold on to it? Because, we have at least one of her cabinet ministers who throughout the election was openly campaigning to be the next leader of the UCP. He's continuing to do so. And Danielle Smith has managed to alienate a lot of the far right folks that helps her get the leadership. And so she, before the election even happened, the knives were already coming out for her, and it's going to be fascinating to see how long she can hold on to power.
It was a strange election from my perspective, or from our perspective. I guess in a way, Alberta politics has reconfigured in a way that's kind of like politics used to be, in that there's two parties running, and it's a very close election, but someone won with a majority, and that's something that we're not used to anymore. So when it's a close election, there's going to be a minority, isn't there?
We've never had, I don't believe, in Alberta. There's a gentleman named Dave Berta or Dave Cornier, who would be probably a much more reliable source, but I seem to recall that there has never been a minority government in Alberta. Prior to the NDP forming government in 2015, it was a 44-year dynasty of the PCs, and prior to that, it was the Socreds. So the transition for Alberta has been, over the last 8 years, arguably, we've moved from a one-party state to a two-party state,
which I guess is progress in a way.
Well, it depends.
It's certainly, I know the first time Rachel Notley won, as an ignorant Ontarian, and I'd say that unironically, it's kind of true. I was like, sorry, what happened? The NDP won, and then this time I was like, okay, the NDP could win again. It does not compute with Eastern Canadian or Central Canadian sort of views of the West, of Alberta in particular. So obviously, there's a hell of a lot of people out there who do not fit within the cliched. There's only one type of Alberta and only one party state kind of views. So what's the kind of picture underneath everything that's going on in Alberta at the moment? Obviously, we're seeing more and more polarization with the party, with the old Conservatives becoming something different. But what's going on in the broader realm?
I think there's a lot of things that are happening. I mean, one of the things that's very, very clear in this election is the stark divide between rural and urban Alberta. And they are two, as somebody who grew up rurally and then moved to urban for my teen years, the difference in those two worlds, unless you've lived them, is almost impossible to verbalize, because it is so different. So there's a big piece, and that was part of the UCPs. Like they said the quiet part out loud. They were like, as long as we win rural Alberta, we only need a couple of seats. So see ya. And that was their strategy. So there's the rural Alberta piece, and rural Alberta does in many ways have, I mean, it has a completely different culture in so many ways. But it also has a very adversarial relationship in a lot of ways with urban Alberta that has a lot of history to it. Because when you start to take a look at big chunks of Alberta, not just in the South, I mean, Southern Alberta has a lot of stereotypes associated with it, with good reason. But also Northern Alberta, a lot of Alberta was colonized by religious people. I mean, Southern Alberta is famous for the LDS folks. And if you take a look at the actual history of Southern Alberta, all of the irrigation that exists that allows a lot of the agriculture to happen in Southern Alberta was put into place by members of the LDS Church. So that's part of the fabric and the culture that exists. And when you start to talk about particularly religious backgrounds, you tend to lean very heavily in the social conservative realm. Now, you juxtapose that with the major municipalities like Calgary and Edmonton. Edmonton's been a much more socially progressive city for quite some time. And Calgary is starting to move in that direction. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. One of them is certainly we're starting to see more young people who are being more engaged in the things. We're losing a lot of them, unfortunately. But another piece of it is absolutely immigration. There has been a major shift in Calgary and Edmonton in regards to people are coming to Calgary and Edmonton from other parts of the country, but also a lot of other parts of the world. And it's creating a very different and new dynamic. But another one of the pieces, and I think that this is almost impossible to understate, is, you know, Alberta's polarized in a really weird way. And I say it's a really weird way because on one hand, we have the UCP under Danielle Smith, which is the Wild Rose 2.0. It is all of the far right things, unabashedly so. I mean, the number of times that Alberta makes international news in a week because we're basically Florida, but without the beaches and the cruises, is pretty stunning. So there's an extreme right element that has definitely moved itself into very strong positions of power in the province. And at the same time, the NDP, who used to be the lefty party, they made a mad dash for the center starting in like 2016. And that's the space that they're currently trying to occupy. So whether or not you want to say that the province is deeply polarized, or the Overton window has just been moved so far over to the right that it just looks that way now, the dynamics and the demographics have shifted in a big way. And we saw this in the election where there were conservatives, like heavy hitter conservatives in the PC government and the federal PCs for that matter, who came out and were like, this is not conservative anymore. This is a whole different beast. Thomas Lukaszuk, who we had on the show, he was the deputy premier. He was the minister of a bunch of different things. He was an MLA for like 14 years. And he came out very early saying, this is not the conservatism that you're used to. Somebody painted a very different animal blue and they were like, no, but trust us. And so it's a very strange time in Alberta politics because there's a lot of moving pieces.
And I wonder the extent to which Ontario is just following behind. I mean, some of the things that you just mentioned have happened in Ontario too. And the polarization between urban and rural Ontario is absolute. You know, the
There's rural Ontario?
Yeah, so rural Ontario is PC through and through, very, very strongly. And the last Liberal, when the Liberals were still the provincial government, I think the last time they won, they had like one rural seat, and that was actually close to where I live now. So, and it was rural in inverted commas. It had some fields, but it was kind of rural urban mix. So that kind of divide is absolutely there too. We don't have quite the same level of religious craziness, perhaps, but certainly if you look at Doug Ford's caucus, there are some notable. There's been infiltration by religious groups into the PC party. And,
well, Doug Ford got his leadership by catering to the social conservative crowd. And my understanding is he catered to them, got their support, won the leadership. When he won premiership, he basically said, "Okay, go back in the closet. I don't need you anymore," and that ticked off a lot of them, which I think has had like for us, like they've started. You and I have covered it. But they started trying to get into the school boards to try and weasel their way into those
school boards, particularly the Catholic school boards, are kind of open season. That's basically entryism. That's how extreme religious groups, social conservatives, are getting into the political system.
Well, they're saying it out loud out here. We've got an organization in Alberta called Take Back Alberta. Not sure from what they want to take it back, because Alberta's history is pretty clear, but there's an organization called Take Back Alberta, and they said, okay, so first order of business is to get Danielle Smith elected. Second order of business is to take over the UCP board, which they've been exceedingly successful at. They have more than half of the board now, and their AGM's coming up in a couple months, and they're very well positioned to take over the rest of the board of that party. But they're also already organizing for the school boards and the city council.
The thing is, it's not actually like you. Both Joel and myself have a history of both being involved in party politics as kind of volunteers and staffers, and actually running for office as well. I ran for council back in 2018. And Joel, you actually ran for the school board.
Yep.
We were both equally successful as you. The trauma is real, but what you do realize from having been involved is like there's so few people who actually get up and join a political party that it's not that difficult to say, okay, I need 100 friends or 200 friends, particularly if you're a member of a church or a religious organization of whatever kind. Okay, you all just need to come along, cast your vote today, so that we can get. And it's partly down to secular Canadians being so bad at organizing themselves that the religious groups or whatever groups, whatever single interest groups that don't necessarily share the interests of the party they're infiltrating, can do it so damn easily. Really, was that your experience in Alberta as well?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I've said it before on the show, and I've said it before in other places as well, that one of the things that sets the right apart, and I'm air quoting that because it's such a broad term, is the tendency for there to be some sort of religious background, especially in Alberta. And so when you have people who have religious backgrounds, they have some experience already with evangelizing. Mm-hmm. And the big difference between the right and the left in Alberta is the right will go, hey, we're just not going to stop. We're going to keep going no matter what. And it doesn't matter if people don't like us. We believe in this cause. We believe that our own personal stakes are such that we have to remain invested in it. I mean, it overlaps unbelievably well with some practitioners of some faiths he tried to hedge, as he said it. But when you take a look at the left in Alberta, the reaction, am I allowed to swear on this thing?
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool.
CRTC can't stop us yet, so
they can't. No, don't. I don't want to have that conversation again today. But you take a look at the left, and as soon as the left is presented with something that they don't like, they go, "Ah, fuck it, I'm out," and that's it, and they walk away, and they go try to start their own little club until somebody does that to them, and there's no commitment in anywhere near the same realm as you see on the right. And the other thing that the right is really, really good at, because of that sort of evangelical background, is they've already identified, oh, you got to get them young. So they have, especially on the right, they have an incredibly effective networking and organizational skills when it comes to, well, let's make sure that we get the youth involved. You take a look at some of the press secretaries and some of the early appointments that went into the Jason Kenney government, and the overwhelming majority of staffers that were put into quite high positions were like 25 and under. Right. No previous experience other than party work.
Well, that's the thing with, like, here in Ontario, again, as Roland was saying, I think we're just, the right is just a few steps behind the Albertan right, and it's because I think you're right. It comes down to, like, being able to be disciplined. Like, the right is very disciplined in being able to say, okay, what's our end goal, and the compromises that you have to make in politics along the way. The right can very much say, I can deal with this because it's all on my path towards the victory that I want to achieve, whatever it is. The left, those compromises, I'd rather win that ideological victory of, well, at least my integrity and my convictions are pure, than say, yeah, but that means you lose the war. Like, you're not going to attain you're not going to be able to move the measuring stick any further down the field, because you just won't pick it up because of your integrity and your principles, which that's fine for you. But the frustrating part is there's always somebody counting on you to help them out. And that's what politics is about. Like, if you're elected as an MLA or an MPP or an MP, the end goal is you're there to help out, in my mind, the lowest person in society, to make sure that they're looked after in whatever way, whether it's getting them, make sure they have opportunity at gainful employment or education or whatever the case may be. And if you're willing to sacrifice that person because, well, my principles are more important than your well-being, then you've lost. And that's why, like, you see, we've been frustrated because we see the right make all these compromises on seemingly their principles, because we know that they say, no, we're here to win it. And the left would rather make that compromise and leave thousands of people no better off than they were the day before, because, at least I got my principles, which is why, I think in this country you see, the federal government is the Liberal Party. They are failing in the polls, in my opinion. They are failing at winning over those people, because those on the left, those left-minded individuals are losing their trust, because you're not doing anything. Your principles are so much more important to you than actually helping people on the ground. And
I don't even know if it's about the principles, though, with the left. Like, the beef that I have with the left is that if you say, like, one of the things that blows my mind is there's no question that the bent of the breakdown is progressive. Like, there's just no, I mean, our one of our rules of engagement is nobody gets a pass. So it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum on. If you're behaving badly, then we're going to call you out and probably make some jokes at your expense. But at the end of the day, there's no question that the breakdown has a progressive bent to things. That being said, we get more tips and information from folks on the right than we do certainly in the last 6 months, from folks on the left, because we did a series at the beginning of, I want to say 2022, where we took a look at the problems that exist inside of political parties. And we sat down with a couple of people who were former NDP staffers. We sat down with a couple of people who were former NDP MLAs and ministers, and they kind of talked about, here's where the culture is fundamentally broken. And what it comes down to is, in conservative circles, there is an awareness that even if I disagree with you, I can still work with you to move things forward potentially. And we might not agree on all the things, and we might not move the things forward that I want. Like, I'm not going to get all the things that I want, but maybe we can work on some things collaboratively. And on the other parts, we'll just say, fuck you. Whereas progressives, the left, certainly in Alberta, if you are perceived in any way to have slighted them, then it's game over. They won't talk to you. They won't acknowledge your existence. They won't work with you in any sort of collaborative way. It's done. And it's fascinating because it's just their way of hobbling themselves. Like, there was a recent incident, and this was actually really educational for everybody who works on the show, because there was what appeared to be a memo that was announcing that the former chief medical officer of health, Dr. Henshaw, had been hired back to Alberta Health Services, working in a totally different portfolio. It aligned perfectly with when her contract with BC terminated. It was presented and formatted in all of the right ways. And we amplified it, and we said, well, that'd be pretty wild. And it turns out, it appears that it was inaccurate. It was a forgery. We immediately said, okay, we got taken. Just goes to show misinformation's a bitch, y'all. But the response from some of the progressive media was to say, see, look, they suck. And it's like, you never see any other media outlet. And we're not journalists. I want to be clear that the breakdown, we make that very, very clear, because we use fucking puppets, for Christ's sakes. But we're not journalists. But when you see other media outlets, you don't see them taking a victory lap when somebody else falls down, and you don't see them invalidating them. You see them go, that sucks for them, but we don't need to punch down. We're not going to do that, because it invalidates the entire culture. But there's a tendency for progressives to go, we're better. And that's just them getting in their own way. And it's really, really unfortunate, because I think it's one of the things ultimately that really hurt the NDP in the last provincial election.
I mean, that's another thing that's very familiar. I mean, here, obviously, Ontario, there are basically liberal. If you're talking about urban Ontario, there are Liberal cities, there are NDP cities, and boy, no vitriol is greater than the hatred of a Liberal or an NDP volunteer for the other party. Far greater than the loathing for the Conservatives. And it's like, well, and then you look, the last election, we sort of did episodes going through the platforms, because it's like, well, nobody else ever reads them, so why don't we actually just take a look at it? And it's like, in all honesty, the NDP platform could have been written by the Liberals. The Liberal platform could have been written by the NDP. The difference was so small. It was tiny. And it's like, and you assholes are gonna carry on arguing and guarantee that the PCs win another election. We just interviewed one of the leadership candidates for the Liberal Party the other week. Basically, I think he said, I'd have to go back and check. Basically, like, I'm not even thinking about the next election. We're looking at 2 elections down. It's like, we're dealing with a kind of crisis in education, a crisis in healthcare. And you're saying, we're not even going to, we're just building. We're not going to try and win the next one. When there's a clear majority of Ontarians at every election who will happily vote NDP or Liberal, but cannot get themselves organized to pick one or the other. It's so frustrating. And it's like this, our electoral system, the way it works, just gives the prize to whoever's basically the most organized and the most unified, but not necessarily the most numerous in terms of actual votes. And that's a tragedy right across the country. I think that and such a big part of the ability of polarizing parties to actually do well electorally, because under a different electoral system, you can't win. The math doesn't work. To say, okay, we're going to get a majority government with 30% of the vote, which is, I don't know, what did Doug Ford get the last election? 31, 32?
30, like 33%, I think, of the vote. No, sorry. But he, of all eligible voters, everyone who's eligible to vote in Ontario, he got a whopping 17%.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, yeah, I mean, that's just...
That's an inspiring figure you have there.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just the thing. Well,
it partly speaks to how pathetic and woeful the opposition parties, all the opposition parties were. They were just abysmal.
That's the wild thing about this last Alberta election, though, is like, if you take a look at the UCP platform and the NDP platform, with one or two exceptions, it's the same platform, like the similarities. And there were a lot of people who commented on like, so what's like, it's the same platform, but the NDP made the fatal mistake of announcing that they were going to increase corporate taxes. And that allowed the UCP to say, I mean, it was a 3% increase that they were looking at, but 3% of 8 is apparently like 36% or something. And so the UCP not only got to campaign on saying, look, the NDP want to raise taxes, but they also got to say, and they want to raise them by 38%. That's what they're going to do to you. And that was, especially in somewhere like Battleground Calgary, that was a huge delineating factor. But if you take a look at the vast majority of the rest of the platforms, there was a stunning number of similarities.
I mean, and the PCs here don't even put out a platform anymore. They're just like, hey, we've got Doug, vote for us. That is the complete.
You laugh, but Roland is absolutely 100% correct on that's as much as we could figure in the last campaign. That was their strategy. Just vote Doug.
Yeah, but the Greens, the Liberals, the NDP, they'd obviously read each other's platforms. They're structured the same. They've got the same basic talking points. They're using the same language. They're the same fucking platforms. It's so annoying. And it's like I was just thinking, it's like the generals, back in in the First World War, where the generals of the armies sort of refused to accept that they were in a trench warfare, battle of attrition. They were like, okay, we need the cavalry because any minute now we're going to get out of these trenches and go charging across the fields, just like it's 1815 again. And the political parties are behaving like that. It's like, okay, well, we just need to keep on doing the same thing, because sooner or later, everybody's going to realize that we're the best and they're all going to unify behind us, and then we'll be off to the races. And it's like, but that's not how politics works anymore. We're so much more fractured as a society. Plus, you've got three parties basically serving up the same thing and pretending that they're different. What the hell do we expect to happen? I don't know. How do we fix this?
Well, I mean, the delineating factor, there was one huge delineating factor in the election, and it was the leaders. We had, on one hand, Danielle Smith, who, like, it's remarkable how she can't go more than like 48 hours without doing something that everybody goes, wait, what? It's truly stunning.
I have to ask you, does she actually believe the stuff that she's saying, or is it like a gimmick to reach out to the SoCon components of her supporters? Like, I can't believe she can't actually believe all the stuff that she's saying to the microphone, does she?
I think there's a couple of different factors. Like, I've only met her twice, and there's a fascinating thing about Smith. I've talked to a lot of people who spent a lot of time with her, especially when she was in the legislature. And the consensus seems to be that Danielle Smith is very, very good at, and she's a very strong orator. So like, if you give her a script, she can do extraordinarily well. She is a compelling speaker, which drives people crazy, because when she doesn't have a script, the stuff that comes out of her mouth is, I mean, you can go, she's got a locals page, which is, I'm told, it's like a paid per view social media platform. I have not looked at it that closely. Fortunately, there's somebody who's does work with the show who is a subscriber, and they wade through that, so I don't have to, which is awesome. But it's a place where Danielle Smith has largely said, hey, what if all ideas are welcome? What if we just say, you know what, if you have a thought, say it, let's see what happens. And unfortunately, what happens when you do that sort of thing is you have people who don't understand complex issues, who try to reduce those complex issues to something that they can understand. And in that process, they make a lot of shit up. And this is part of the reason why we see Danielle Smith on her first day as premier, after she swore in her cabinet, she was like, oh, the WEF are the worst. She got that from her audience. She is historically, when she was in the legislature, what I've been told is that when she was in question period, she would have questions that were given to her, and she could read those, and she could sound really, really good and compelling when she read them. But if you got her off script, she was lost. And if you got her off her talking points that she's committed to memory, she's lost. And we saw that when she was in radio, because when she was doing radio after her political career, she would welcome all viewpoints, and she absorbed some of those. I mean, she's someone who shared out the famous tweet where she was like, hey, hydroxychloroquine cures COVID 100%. She doesn't have the filters that say, hey, before I say this thing, let me just think about it for a second. She doesn't have that. And it's a constant. The best way I can describe Danielle Smith when she's not on script, from what I've seen and from what I've heard from people who know her and have worked with her, is it's a constant brainstorming session. But it's a brainstorming session that is also informed by, and I will never admit that I'm wrong. So she'll say whatever thought floats into her head. But then if it's a bad thought, she won't say, oh, I kind of shit the bed on that one. Like the stage 4 cancer comments that she made, she never properly apologized for. She said they'd been taken out of context, which they hadn't. Those were literally the words that it's on video. What do you want? And there's been plenty of examples where she's said profoundly offensive, ill-informed things. And rather than take responsibility for them, she just, I was taken out of, I spoke imprecisely when I said that I was subverting democratic norms. I was speaking imprecisely on video 3 times, but I was imprecise. And the challenge is that at the same time that she does that, she's also got committed to memory. Like I like to think about Ralph Klein. And, he always said, you take responsibility, you learn from your mistakes, and then you move on. And she's got that line that she puts out over and over and over again. And so her audience, her base that support her go, look, she's just like Ralph Klein. And they never take a look at the fact that she's never actually done any of those things. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating about Smith, is because it is a constant brainstorming session. You can even see it. Like if you go and you watch some of her interviews, or you watch her when she's being interviewed, she does this thing where she kind of looks up to the side, and you can say, oh, wait for it. It's coming. Here it comes. It's going to be good. And that's when,
I guess the lesson of the last decade and a half of politics worldwide is that the looser the cannon, the more potentially popular they can be. Donald Trump, there's a man who's with words coming out of his mouth that are out of his mouth before they've gone through a synapse in his brain. They're clearly just whatever he wants to say at that moment is coming out. Doug Ford. Doug Ford is almost like an old school professional politician compared with some of these guys. But there's a contingency of people who basically like, the bigger the agent of chaos we can choose, the bigger the asshole, the more outspoken, the more idiotic they are. That's good from our point of view. Do you think that's partly what's going on here?
I don't think that's actually what's happening. I think what's actually happening is, and I'll refer you back to the rant I did about the left earlier, progressives. You take a look at Clinton's campaign, the baskets of deplorables. Progressives have done a very, very good job of saying to people that they disagree with, or who are perhaps not as informed about complex issues, you're wrong. And not only are you wrong, you're a bad person for being wrong. And so when you get somebody like Donald Trump, when you get somebody like Danielle Smith, who comes out and she says all the things that you've been thinking, now you're okay to be you again. And like one of the biggest, there's a conversation I watched with where Jon Stewart interviewed like these 4 disease control experts, and all of them were like, holy cow, if we learned one thing from COVID, we can't communicate worth shit. We are terrible at communicating. We had all of this science, we had all of this evidence, and because we couldn't communicate it, other people tried to, but they didn't understand it. So instead of here's what a vaccine's supposed to do, here's how it's supposed to work, you had people like Jason Kenney standing up with a whiteboard and trying to teach a biochem class that they, we're talking about somebody who didn't even study biochem as far as we know. So like it's that's where the failure is. And I think that because there is a not small segment of the population that has been made to feel like there's something wrong with them for what they believe, as opposed to saying, let's bring you along.
Right.
When you have somebody like a Trump or a Smith who says, you know what, fuck those guys. They have been judging you. They have been pushing you down. They are trying to take away everything that you want. They are the other.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, no, I like I like what you just said there.
I agree with. I think both of you have. You both of you said things that are true. I would just add one further point to that, is that the left, whenever they got in power, I don't think made enough of an impact on people's lives. On that those kitchen table issues, the left like to hold their principles. We're gonna create this great big overarching, look at climate change, right? Climate change is a major issue. It's a global issue. We all need to do something about it. But it's hard to connect that to the kitchen table when people are right now currently saying, I need to pay the mortgage. I need to pay the grocery bills. My job's not paying me enough to do these things. What am I going to do? I don't really care about a carbon pricing scheme or carbon capture or whatever have you. And that's the thing, is that when here in Ontario, when the Liberals were in power, yeah, they had some wins, they had some significant wins, but at the end of the day, they didn't change the lives of people on the ground enough for them to say, like the average person on the ground saying, my life doesn't change, whether it's a conservative government or a small L liberal government, NDP in Alberta or UCP, or conservative here in Ontario, or liberal or NDP. They say, my life doesn't change that much. In fact, it just gets harder and harder. So yeah, when somebody like Danielle Smith or Donald Trump step up to the microphone and just lets it fly, it's like, yeah, why not? My life isn't going to change one way or another. And if I can cause a little bit of discomfort or maybe really stick it to somebody else, so be it, because my life isn't going to change. My problems aren't going away.
I think part of the other one of the other factors that's involved in it as well is the approaches that the left and the right historically take to how they do politics. The right takes a very sort of adversarial. I mean, Danielle Smith didn't run against Rachel Notley. She ran against Justin Trudeau. That was the entire UCP campaign. There is that adversarial component. And where I think progressives and the left fall down always is that they try to imagine what it would be like to be inspirational or aspirational. And when they try to behave like somebody who, I think this is how somebody who is inspirational or aspirational would behave, because they don't actually hold those values to be true, they fail. I don't know about you, but I'm loving my federal proportional representation that was brought to us by the Liberals. I think it's working great. When we're talking about leaders who conduct themselves with ethics, SNC-Lavalin is a regular thing that gets brought up here in Alberta. The reason why Justin Trudeau has failed to overcome his father's legacy in the province of Alberta is because he has not demonstrated himself in a tangible way to be different. And when there's Danielle Smith, Donald Trump, you know what you're going to get. That person is going to say some crazy shit and it's going to be super offensive.
Yeah.
There's nobody's surprised by that. But when you have somebody like Justin Trudeau or Rachel Notley who come in and they're like, I am inspirational and I aspire to be better things and I will get elected, and then do none of them, then everybody goes, well, I've just been lied to.
Well, that's here in Ontario. I mean, Doug Ford and the Conservatives ran basically their ethos. You're right. They're adversarial. They're adversarial to the essence of government. Like we've recently found out that they're sitting on $22 billion. There's $22 billion in the government coffers. And they just like, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you, we have $22 billion in the bank. Yeah, our bad. And it's like we have
much of which came from the provincial government for spending during COVID.
Yeah, like the government, our provincial government does not want government to do anything. So everything's getting privatized. Everything is getting sold off. We've got Galen Weston's going to be giving us, we can cash in our PC optimum points to get a cardiac surgery at some point. I'm pretty sure down the pipeline. You laugh. Give me 5 years and that will be a reality.
Oh no, I laugh because it's true.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like, oh, somebody else will do it. Somebody else will teach our kids. Somebody else will do look after us and do the heart surgeries and all that stuff. And that's just it. Like, it's that adversarial, but you're right, that adversarial nature is what kind of gets done, because government didn't do anything, whether it's federal or provincial or municipal. It doesn't do anything to act, and it could. I guess that's the frustrating part, is that a lot of progressives, I think the three of us could say it could, but you have to take a chance and you have to take a risk and you have to be willing to actually do the work and make it work. And they're not doing it. And so when you have somebody like Danielle Smith or Doug Ford coming in and saying, yeah, you're right. So you know what? Let's just farm it out to the next person, the next billionaire who comes along and says, oh, I'll pay for that hospital. I'll pay for that schoolyard. Okay, yeah, great. Look, we're getting stuff done. No, you're not. And when it goes to shit, like, what does it matter if I voted my MPP or my MLA? Nothing's going to change.
I mean, really, what the thing that unifies maybe everything we've said is that the progressive parties, whether centrist or further to the left, and basically by the time the NDP come the Liberals regularly across the country. When the NDP win, they win because they've gone to the centre. We saw it with Andrea Horwath here. She tried it didn't work out. Ironically, the Liberals actually went further left at that election and won a majority. I mean, anyway, that's by the way. But the progressive parties need to want to win as much as the Conservatives do. It's really that simple. It's like, winning is more important than anything else. We have to form the government. And it doesn't matter. I mean, again, our political system, just because of that betrayal by Justin Trudeau in his first year in office or whatever it was, just doesn't encourage that. And yet you'd think that by now the parties would be going, you know what, we can't keep on beating a head against the wall this way. We've got to change something.
Well, because I think the problem is they're not actually interested in. When you hold a gun to any of these politicians' heads and you say to all of them, please don't hold guns to anyone's heads. Just to be clear, this is a metaphor. Nobody be stupid. I know you guys have some gun problems out there, so I just wanted to be clear. And you say to them, okay, you can either choose to save that starving baby in the street and you take the bullet, or you don't take the bullet and we all walk away. Everybody walks away every time. And I would argue, I can't speak for outside of Alberta, because I don't pay that much attention to federal politics because we've got this dumpster fire going over here that's just so entrancing. But I would argue that within provincial politics, the parties and I would definitely argue that the progressive parties are super guilty of this. They don't want people who are going to represent the electorate. They don't want people who are going to speak up, challenge the norms, try to push the needle. They want very good poodles, please. And if you can be a very, very good show poodle, and if you tick off a certain number of the things that we want for this particular constituency, then you can come and play, and you can be a very good show poodle. And again, this is where I go back to the conversations that we had with Stephanie McLean and Robin Luff and some of the NDP staffers. They were very, very clear that if you played ball and you did what you were told, you got a treat. But if you didn't, then you got spanked hard. And it's that piece that I think progressive parties have to figure out how they're going to solve. Because you know what, if you want to be inspiring and aspirational, you're going to have to be willing to accept a couple of loose cannons that aren't always going to be perfectly in line with coiffed hair. You're going to need to have some, you're going to need to recognize you need some people who are willing to get a little bit of blood on their knuckles from time to time, because that's what people demand. And if you aren't willing to provide that because your desire for message control is so complete, then enjoy being the opposition forever.
Mm-hmm.
It's the tragedy of the media, it's the tragedy of the whole political system, that we all get furious that politicians just to be a backbench MLA or a backbench MPP is a truly shitty job. You have no power, no influence. You're just voting fodder to walk through the lobbies and vote the way you're told. You don't get to write your own speeches. You don't get anything. You're handed a piece of paper, a good day, you get to read out a piece of paper that was actually written by some 25-year-old staffer who's completely unaccountable, but who is working in the premier's office. It's a shit job. And we're expecting like our brightest and smartest people to want to go and do that. Well, they don't, increasingly. And
because they don't want to sell out.
Certainly with the right, they don't even want those guys running for them. It's like, no, we don't want smart people. We want drones. We want people who will be silent and obedient. And I think the public totally gets that on a kind of profound level, even though people can be spectacularly uninformed about particularly provincial politics, because we're all obsessed with, I'm like you, I'm not remotely obsessed with federal politics. That's generally, I find it very boring. But most people watch Power and Politics or watch whatever, and it's the federal stuff that they pay attention to, and they know nothing about the provincial story. But I do think that at a kind of deep level, people get that this isn't the way it's supposed to work. That even if you have a good MPP, they're just part of this system that they should be able to speak their mind. They should be able to represent their ridings, and they don't, and they can't. And if they did, they would be fired. And
Robin Luff was.
Yeah, I mean that's the root of the kind of cynicism that underlies everything, I think. And it's also why when you get squeaky wheels and loose cannons, people are like, okay, well, they may be an asshole, but at least they're an asshole who's clearly not controlled by some backroom staffer. You can see the attraction, can't you?
I mean, if I was the NDP and I was picking candidates for this last election, I would have had a quota of loose cannons. I would have said, okay, so I got 87. I want, I don't know, 10 that we know we're not going to be able to control inside the legislature. We know that they're going to be dogfighters in for the issues that they're passionate about. We know that's going to happen. We'll have 10. But instead of them making any room for those, they go, we will have 87 very good poodles, please. Mm-hmm. And we saw it where there was a First Nations candidate here in Calgary who got the nomination, and she called out the Stampede Board and some of the large corporations on social media. I think it was a tweet. I'm working from memory. I could be wrong. And it wasn't like, I mean, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but anybody who's surprised that there are First Nations folks who've got some issues with like the whole colonial apparatus. You need to pay more attention, I think, because they've kind of been screwed for a few hundred years. I imagine there's
it shouldn't be surprising that a First Nations person would have objections to that. And yet when it happens, we're like, oh, look, disunity
24
in the
hours.
party. Clearly it's a disaster. We can't elect these people because
they had her removed within 24 hours. You tell me that you can do an investigation of any kind in 24 hours. It was like done.
Yeah, that. See, I find that that's what drives people off of politics, is that you have these, either you're not vetting the people that you're running for your party, or you are, and you have no backbone to stand up when they have actual opinions on, it's how the issue of Stampede is a colonial apparatus. Is it? I don't know. I've never been to Stampede. I'm not going to chime in on that. But I know here in Ontario, on our back doorstep, we have Caledonia, which is on the bordering the Six Nations Reserve. It has been in a perpetual land dispute, one of the biggest ones going back in Canadian history. And if I remember correctly, right now there are First Nations members occupying land that's trying to be developed by a developer. And we've had on First Nations reporters on the podcast to talk to them, like, what's going on here, what's the news. And it's the question we always come back to is like, okay, if this land is so contested, why doesn't the province just sort of say no? Like, you have other parts to develop. Like, you can build houses in other parts of the township of Caledonia. Why do you have to do it on this plot of land? Because there's a whole backstory of, like, there was a previous land dispute and they just moved like across the street. Like, literally, they just went across the road, said, okay, we'll build on this land. And the First Nations like, no, that's our land too. Like, it doesn't work that way. And they're like, well, we didn't know. And like, it's just one of these things, like you say, would it be great to have an MPP or a candidate stand up and say, yeah, I have some issues I have some thoughts on this. I want, the province does have a position to play on this in this role. Because I just forget part of my French, but like, have some balls and stand up for some convictions. And what's the worst that they're gonna say? Oh, we want to build a house. It's their land. It'd be no different than me saying, Nate, I want to build a shed in your backyard. I don't care if it's your backyard. I want to build a shed there.
Do I get to use the shed?
No, it's my shed, right? I want to build my shed on your backyard, and right. It's just like, to me, that's the equivalent. It's their land. They say, no, I don't want to build anything here. Just don't do it.
The problem, I think, is that for so many Canadians, like, I live in a province where the ethics commissioner has said, so when MLAs get elected, we should probably give them classes on how government works. That's literally a thing that's happened in the last month, because Danielle Smith, as premier, represented a fundamental threat to democracy. Ethics commissioner said roughly those words. Because she decided that she was going to try to pressure the justice system to release a hate-ridden pastor. We live in that's the province that I live in, where the ethics commissioner literally had to say, okay, so all of these people who are now running government, they need to go back to high school and get remedial training on how government actually works. We live in a country where like half of BC is in Canada. And when you say that to people, there's a stunning number of people who don't know what unceded territories are. The notion that there are huge tracts of land that were never signed with treaties. And I mean, there's places out east as well, for sure, but there's huge tracts of land. Like, half of BC doesn't belong to Canada. That's a literal legal ruling. And BC's and the federal government are, of course, panically trying to get all of these new treaties signed in order to be like, no, but it's cool, right, guys? But it's that lack of understanding that you take a look at the pipeline problems that we had here in Alberta, where there have been pipelines that have been tried to be jammed through northern Alberta, and huge parts of northern Alberta don't technically belong to Canada. And a bunch of First Nations folks said, yeah, you can't put that shed up in my backyard.
Mhm.
And Alberta said, but we want to. And then we got mad at Justin Trudeau, and he was like, okay, so maybe there are actually some laws that are involved here, and we should probably sort that shit out.
My understanding, that's pretty much been Canada's First Nations relationships since prior to Confederation. Like that's pretty much it. We want to build this here. Well, that's our land. Well, but we want to put it there. Can we? No. We'll do it anyways.
I mean, the thing, and I would love to speak to somebody, a legal expert who actually knows how this stuff works, because I don't get any of it. And also, you can tell from my accent, I didn't grow up in this country. It's a strange thing that, to see, say, First Nations people going to a Ontario court to say that land belongs to them, where it's like, well, you predate the court. How does the court get to have a say in this? How did we persuade the First Nations to use our legal system?
Oh, we didn't. We didn't. We didn't persuade them. We forced them to 100%. And I'll use this as an opportunity to plug an amazing book that I think every Canadian should read. 21 Things You Probably Don't Know About the Indian Act. That should be mandatory reading for every Canadian, because
I got on the bookshelf back there.
There you go.
Yeah.
That is, if you want to know how badly Canada, for literally hundreds of years, fucked First Nations and Indigenous peoples, and just said, you know what, we're just going to take this stuff, and if you don't like it, then we're going to take your kids and we're going to train the savage out of them. Like that is our history. And to not acknowledge that, and to have people in positions of power, to have people in positions of government who can't wrap their heads around the fact that these are ongoing issues. And yeah, you can't just run a pipeline through land that isn't part of the fucking country. That is a failure of what we're demanding from our elected leadership.
Yeah, and like we've got the same issue here in Ontario. I mean, everyone would remember in Ontario I want to say it was a while ago, but it wasn't really, when Doug Ford pushed through, forced the QP strikers to take a contract by forcing them with the notwithstanding clause. That was a first here in Ontario. I'm not sure if you heard about that in Alberta.
I was probably distracted.
So, okay, I'll let you know. So in Ontario, QP, which is a major union, it'd be out in Alberta as well. In our schools, basically the custodial staff and some of the administrative staff, they were striking or going to be striking, I should say, as they were in negotiations for a new contract. Rather than negotiate in good faith, Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Education, imposed a contract on them and said, you are going to accept it, and we're going to force you to accept it by invoking the notwithstanding clause on them. First time it was ever used in labor negotiations between government and a participating party. That got every union in this province up in arms. Even the unions that Doug Ford had won over in the previous election, they all got up in arms. We never saw solidarity in this level, I think, ever. The number of unions who were potentially going to strike showed in solidarity, and basically had to step back. But it was more shocking the fact that the premier, in order to get his point with a labor dispute, was going to throw in the nuclear option of the notwithstanding clause. I think a lot of people just sat back and said, "Oh my God! Like how like, do you understand how this works, or what the point of this clause is?" Like you had.
And that incident also showed, because Doug Ford did climb down, and he basically said, "Okay, I'm not going to do that after all." And in one day, the labor movement was able to do what the opposition parties haven't managed to do in
That's true.
best part of a decade. And not only have they not been able to do it, the opposition parties they're not even on the same planet as that. They, the idea that the opposition holds the government to account in Ontario is just, since 2018, has just not been the case. They've just and partly COVID had a role. I get that, but it's an absolute joke, the extent to which, and if you're in the opposition parties, to be fair to them, you can't, partly because they're so damn boring, they can't get on TV, they can't get on radio. No one wants to listen to politicians anymore.
Well, the terrible speaker.
Yeah, I mean, the new NDP leader here, Marit Stiles, who came very highly recommended by everybody. I have yet to see her speak in any capacity.
You know what the funny thing is, Nate? You said they're horrible speakers. I agree when they have a microphone in front of them, because we've had politicians on this podcast, and when we turn off the mic, say, "Okay, the recording's done," we have the best conversations with them.
Oh yeah,
and it's I was like, you have conversations like, "This is what you really think of the matter. Like, this is fantastic." Say just say that. Just do that at the microphone, and you'll win people over. People are like, "Wow, I've never heard that before," and they never do it. We say like, just say that. Next time you're on a press conference, say that. That's what people want to hear. And they never do. And I say, well, okay, fine. You can do the scripted lines, but
the biggest crime in politics is to be boring.
Oh yeah.
And yet we have created a system that breeds boringness. And that the only person who's allowed to have a personality is the leader, and often they're struggling. Backbenchers have to be as boring as possible. And then we wonder why people don't vote anymore, why everybody's turned off by the whole thing. The only way out of this is to sort of release the hounds, let them speak.
We have an opposition MLA in Alberta who is incredibly well-spoken. When she goes in the legislature, or even when she's speaking casually, she is an incredibly powerful speaker. She is charismatic. She is personable. She has an incredible social media footprint when she chooses to exercise it. Oh, but she's gay. And so what we see with the NDP, oh no, I agree with you, man. Totally. That shouldn't matter.
Who cares?
This, I know.
Yeah.
But what we saw was this incredibly charismatic, personable, relatable individual who any other time other than the election is one of the people that the NDP pushed to the front, was relegated in effect to traveling the province and door knocking. We didn't see her at a single press conference. She didn't make a single NDP announcement. And that is, again, exactly what you're talking about. Like, they have the people who are incredibly compelling and are subject matter experts. I mean, this person has an extensive background. I'll tell you what my biggest beef is with the NDP in Alberta right now. And I've said this before, but you got me kind of going now, so I'm gonna lean right into it. There is a media outlet that we have out here that is, unfortunately, it's starting to gain national reach. We're very sorry. It's called the Western Standard. And they published an editorial 6 months ago, give or take, where it was some hack who decided that he was going to speculate on the LGBTQ nightmare world that would exist if the NDP won the election and this MLA was made to be the Minister of Education. And there would be trans story times going on in all of the public schools. And that person later turned around and said, yeah, so that was clickbait, wasn't it? I totally leaned into all the dog whistles. I probably shouldn't have done that. And he issued an apology. So, do with that what you will, but the Western Standard never apologized. And the NDP's response was to say, well, we're not going to take any questions from the Western Standard. We're going to freeze them out now because that was rude and disrespectful. And that became one of the bigger topics that went on throughout the provincial election, because Western Standard would send their reporters out and the NDP would go, "We're not talking to you."
Mm-hmm.
And that became a narrative in and of itself. And I said since day one, what the NDP should have said is, you know what? You're goddamn right. If we get elected, Janice Irwin is going to be one of the most amazing education ministers that this province has ever seen. And all of your fear mongering about things that are never going to happen, we're never going to do. Trans story time is never going to be a curriculum item. If that's something a school decides to do, have a conversation with that school. The Minister of Education's job is to make sure that education is properly funded, class sizes are managed, and there is literally no one who's running in this election who is more qualified to be the Minister of Education than Janice Irwin. So thanks for the idea, Western Standard. Next question. That's what they should have done.
And I think that makes a really key, really important point. I feel like politicians are successful, and you may not be politicians who listen to this podcast but they were successful in their day. And you know, the Canadian context is probably the most hated people in Alberta. But say the original Trudeau or a Chrétien or those guys. What you can say about those guys, love them or loathe them, is they didn't care who they fucked off, who they pissed off. They were willing to say, yeah, you're damn right. You're not going to like this because I'm not doing it for you. This kind of idea that we now have to have, that the progressive parties try to be everything to all people. It's like, well, let's never offend anybody. It's like, no, fuck it. I'm going to offend these right-wing dicks because they're dicks. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to vote for me anyway, so they can go fuck themselves. And I think that's a key part of being a successful politician, actually. And it doesn't mean being vindictive and going out of your way to sort of hurt particular sectors of society. It does mean recognize who's actually going to give you the votes, because that's the only way you're actually going to win the prize. And you're never going to get 100% of the votes. The Conservatives are very good at recognizing exactly who's going to vote for them, going after for them, and they don't care that they're pissing off all the mung-bean-eating pinko liberals like me. They won't speak to me. They won't call me. We are just in the outer darkness as far as they're concerned. They don't need my world to give them a single vote.
What I don't understand about like the left-right divide in politics is that the right constantly isolates itself. The right honestly will always go into that bubble of social conservatism. It seems, regardless where you are in the country, like either, we will not talk to outside voices. Like at least on our podcast, we've reached out to progressive conservatives and conservatives to come on and say, we don't get your point of view. Like, that's what we want to talk to you. We have questions. We're not going to belittle you, but you got to explain this to us because we're not getting it. And they won't come talk to us because we're not in that. We know we're not in that conservative bubble. And I always puzzle is like why people on the left always seem to want to go and play by their rules. And when you look at the math nationally, provincially, at the best that a right-wing government can really, like a core group of people following them, it always seems to be at best 30%. A third of the population really say, no, those are my people. The rest of us are kind of like, I guess, like, just don't burn down the house when we give you the keys, is I think the majority of the Canadian population. And I always wonder, like, how is it that progressive people can't, like, they always want to play by the right-wing tune, right? Like, let's go for the clickbait, let's see how out conservative, how out right-wing we can play this game, as opposed to going to the progressive-minded folks, the everyday folks, say, yeah, like, well, we might have gay books in your kids' schools. Why? Because some of your kids are gay. That's the reality. Like, it's no more conspiratorial than that, right? Gay people exist in Canada. They live and work alongside you. Yeah, maybe someone might want to read some books. Same as we're going to have Black and Indigenous authors as well on the shelves as well. Not because it's some agenda. It's just, why not? They have some nice stories to tell. That's it.
I think a big part of it is, like, progress isn't easy. No. Progress is hard, and it requires will, and it requires bravery, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. because there is a perception that exists that in order for somebody else to progress, I'm going to lose something. It's a false
Oh yeah.
thing for sure, but that's a perception that exists. Whereas when you take a look at, regressive politics, like social conservative politics, that's something that is super easy, because I'm going to, like, it's like I was saying about Smith and Trump earlier. I'm going to play to all of your fears. I'm going to say all of the things that you're not comfortable saying out loud, and I'm going to show you that it's okay. I mean, you take a look at there was I can't remember. I have to look this up because I've used this reference like 5 times in the last 2 weeks. But you take a look at all of the fears that exist about LGBTQ2S plus people, and overwhelmingly, the loudest voices in the room are always men. Why is that? At the end of the day, they're afraid that the gay men are going to treat them like the straight guys already treat women.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And when you take a look at how so much of that fear exists, it comes from a place of, that I need to make this about me in order to try to understand it. I don't care like that. Like, I don't care if I just don't care. Like, that's what my problem is. Like, if you're LGBTQ2S plus, it doesn't involve me. And so it doesn't involve me. But so many people can't wrap their head around the notion. I mean, we're having huge issues in Alberta right now with all of the fear mongering around trans stuff. And it's just like,
we've had the same issues here in Ontario. We've had York Catholic District School Board, which is a school board just literally just north of Toronto. They voted not to raise the pride flag during Pride Month. They're like, I think they're the only Catholic board so far in the province to have not voted to do this year. But it's kind of started up a conversation about, like, why do we fund the Catholic school boards here in Ontario at this point? Because every other we're not going down that road.
Does Alberta have elected school boards the same out there? I'm really showing my ignorance.
We do, yeah. And they're very, very good at not weighing in on
board.
any of these issues.
Yeah. The boards are, like we said earlier, they're a way for right-wing people to get an elected office easily, or relatively easily. So once they're in there, the only reason they're there is to make statements about issues that are no concern of theirs. I mean, school boards have no business trying to legislate on issues of sexuality and gender identity, but they have that platform. So that's what, why else would they be there? Because they're certainly not there because they want to talk about school board budgets, which is actually the job. It's incredibly frustrating. I mean, we should maybe, my time is running up. I just say all our time's running. We shouldn't go on. We could talk forever. I'm sure about that.
Yeah.
We're definitely good at that. But I thought maybe the way to sort of bring this to a close is, with the new, well, it's not a new government, but the return of the existing government. I mean, what's next for Alberta with now what used to be a progressive conservative government now being very much a pretty far right conservative form of conservatism, beyond the kind of reform and even that old school, which used to be held up as a bugbear in Ontario, was like beware reform and the Alliance and those guys. Well, now we've gone far beyond that. What's the impact? What's going to be the outcome of this election for Albertans?
Well, that's a fascinating thing, because there's absolutely no way to know. I mean, as I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of people who are questioning how long Danielle Smith's going to be able to survive as premier. Whoever follows her is then going to largely determine the direction of things. But at the end of the day, I think the big takeaways for the province of Alberta, and we've seen it in the last week already. Danielle Smith announced that she would not in any way cooperate or engage in any conversations about transitioning Alberta's oil and gas. It's happening. Or those jobs. We've got robot trucks. like we've got giant robot trucks up in the oil sands that do all the driving now. It's all centralized, it's all automated. There's only more automation coming. Like this notion that we're somehow going to be able to stop global economic trends and not get laid to waste is absolutely ridiculous. But that's the notion, and that's the platform that the provincial government is currently pursuing. And I think that, you know, the hope that I have in this, I remember when Kenny was elected, and it was actually, to go back to the beginning, the reason why I was dumb enough to run for election in 2019 was because I could read the room and see where Kenny was going to be taking things. And I felt like I had to try to do something about that. It's only going to get worse because Smith continues to embolden the very worst fears and insecurities of Albertans. She only continues to throw fuel on that fire. She refuses to acknowledge any substantive part of Canadian history. And the hope that I have, though, to bring it back there, when Kenny was elected, boy, the creatives showed up. I mean, the quality of satire, the quality of content and graphic design, and some of my favorite T-shirts that I own are from like the first 6 months of the Kenny government, because the creatives showed up. They kind of petered out a little bit, though, and so I'm hoping that what people will do is get that creative again, and more so because God knows there's an embarrassment of riches to work with, but also recognize, I think that we need to have more conversations about what it means to be privileged. And this kind of goes to what you were talking about screen, where you were talking about the measure, you know, sort of, I'll paraphrase with a quote that I use all the time, but the measure of any society is how they take care of their weak and their infirm. And the only way that those people get taken care of is if people with privilege, who have the ability to choose whether or not they're going to get fucked, decide, you know what, I'm going to line up with the people that are getting fucked for a little bit because I can make that choice. And I think that I'm already seeing, like, after the election, we had a lot of people go, I'm out. And there were some voices that said, you know, but if you leave, though, all of the people who can't won't have anybody to have their backs. And I think that there's a bigger conversation that's just in its very infancy, that's starting to go, hey, you know what? There's a lot of people who have enjoyed a lot of privilege for a very long time. And I think that there's a lot of people who are coming to the realization that you will be defined. Your legacy as a human being, your family will be defined by how you choose to utilize that privilege. And I hope you do that.
I find your remarks interesting. This is suitable, I guess, for the end of this episode. The original reason why I reached out to you to kind of do this was, like, here in the 905, Jason Kenney put up a bunch of posters in our bus shelters and in the subways and all whatnot, advertising. You can sell your house here in the 905 in Toronto and move out to Alberta, and you can sell your condo or your little townhouse, and you can get a big sprawling, 2-car garage, white picket fence in the whole backyard, in Calgary and in Edmonton or Lethbridge or any place in Alberta. And it seems to have worked, because there are people who are taking the Alberta people up on that offer to buy their house, and we're seeing this exodus from Ontario. I thought that if Rachel Notley had won, basically that exodus would be like the gas pedal would be stepped on that exodus, and people would just pick up, all the progressives who had money in Toronto and 905 just pick up and leave to go to Alberta. I'd be curious to know if that's going to stay the same now, because I think the Danielle Smith victory I don't think it's going to stop it, but I think it might it's not going to pick up speed. I'm curious to know, I guess what it comes down to is, like, the people leaving here they are progressives. They are people with money, education, very urbanized, who are leaving the 905, going to Alberta. How do you see that maybe changing the dynamic of Alberta politics in the long run? Because I get the feeling that this exodus from the 905 to Alberta isn't a temporary one.
I hope not. Sincerely, I hope not. I hope that, I mean, y'all can keep your dicks, like
Thanks.
You can have them, but I do hope that, I mean, I temper this with the concern that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of people who are doing a lot of really gross real estate investment right now, and it's driving rental prices.
That's possible as well.
The roof,
yeah.
Cough, Vancouver, cough. But I do hope that we do see more people who are of a more progressive bent who come to this province, because as much as we do have a little bit of a Smith problem, it's a big problem. A, we're going to need the help to fix it, and B, Alberta is a province that has been defined by people who move here, for better or for worse. And I think that we've seen some of the worst, but I still believe that there's a great deal of opportunity for the better. And I think that if somebody is trying to make the decision, and they're not horrible people, of whether or not they should move to Alberta, we have great mountains. We've got all of the things. And if y'all have never had a Chinook, it's a game changer. Let me tell you, 10 degrees in February, that's delightful. And we don't have the wet cold that I keep hearing about in Ontario. Like, apparently Ontario, it's a wet cold. It gets into your bones. I'm not sure what that means. We just have cold, and then we get
come here and find out, and you'll be jaded and miserable like the rest of us.
But I do think that there's a very real. I hope Smith doesn't screw it up, because one of two things is going to happen. We will see people recognizing the potential that Alberta has to offer. And there's lots, don't get me wrong. And I think that if people come here, that potential can for sure be built upon. Or all of the young people in Alberta are going to go, oh, hell no. And they're going to move to Ontario, and you guys can clean up.
They can't afford to move to Ontario, trust me.
It's a van thing now. They get these vans, and they like live in the vans, and they park down by the river and do Chris Farley sketches. But it's like a whole culture now.
I think, we should all just buy vans. Maybe I'll just get a van this summer and come out to Alberta. That sounds like the way to go.
It's delightful.
I think both in the good and the bad, I think politically Ontario is not as far behind Alberta in terms of the brewing underbelly of far right politics that is currently going on, that I fear is going to get worse before it gets better. Doug Ford is actually just the start of this thing, and actually, ironically, kind of a moderate and a guy with no discernible principles whatsoever, other than wanting to be premier. But behind him are the ranks of crazy people with eyes that stare in different directions that I fear are coming once he's gone. But also in the good, in that Alberta, like, and Ontario and all the provinces in Canada have so much potential. When we get our acts together and put our minds to it, it just takes an awful lot to get that to actually happen sometimes.
What I took away from
we need it now more than almost at any other point in history for the people who want positive change to get up and make it happen.
What I took away from this conversation is the East-West divide is bullshit. It's an urban-rural divide. If you're listening to this podcast, it's proof that what you're being fed in the media of, Alberta, Ontario, we don't see eye to eye. I disagree. I think our politics are so similar ultimately that it is right now we're facing an urban-rural divide, not an East-West divide in this country. And once again, our politicians at the provincial and federal levels are the last ones to figure this out. But you know what, folks, whether you're listening to this in Calgary or if you're listening to this in Mississauga, keep that in mind. You know,
we're gonna have that tour of Canada in a bus. I have a vision.
we're gonna get an RV and we're gonna go like,
yeah, let's do that.
We're gonna book it across the west. It'll take us like 7 days to get out of Ontario, but once we do, we're booking it. We're booking it for those Rockies.
I'm gonna fly to Winnipeg first.
All right, I'm gonna say let's call it a day there, and it's been a fun chat, Nate.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This was fun. Well, thank you for having us. I don't know where we're putting this, but wherever it shows
Thanks
up,
for teaming up.
Hey, it's
with ours.
Hey, this is what I guess new media is all about, is doing things differently and having actual conversations with people actually on the ground instead of behind a desk in the CTV newsroom. So it's been fun.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Thanks, and we'll do it again sometime.
I'm up for it.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.